November 1942. The thermometer reads -20 degrees on the steppes west of the Volga. Friedrich Paulus has spent the last 3 months trying to erase from the map a city that bears the name of his most formidable enemy. 250,000 people trapped in a pocket of land and rubble. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler has just publicly announced that the Sixth Army has already taken Stalingrad. It was a lie, but it might not have been. That difference, the abyss between what happened and what very nearly happened, is the question that drives this script. This is not empty speculation. The margins by which the fate of Stalingrad was decided were, at several moments, terrifyingly narrow. The Soviets won by a matter of weeks, of tons of steel, of accumulated mistakes made at the Führer's headquarters. Change any one of those variables, and the consequences unfold in a chain reaction that historians have studied for 80 years. We are going to follow that chain all the way to the end. The moment everything could have gone wrong, September and October 1942. On September 14, 1942, the infantry divisions of the German Sixth Army crossed Mamayev Kurgan and reached a point just 800 meters from the Volga. 800 meters. The width of a medium-sized neighborhood. At that moment, the fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread no thicker than a military bootlace. General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, received the news at his command post on the western bank of the river. He had a total of 54 rifle battalions under his command, but at that particular moment most of them had been reduced to fewer than 100 soldiers each. The German 29th Motorized Division and the 14th Panzer Corps had broken through in the northern part of the city. The infantry divisions of the German 8th and 11th Army Corps were advancing through the center. Artillery fire rained down at a rate of several thousand shells per day on the 4 square kilometers that the Soviets still controlled in the southern sector. Chuikov then implemented a tactic that would bear his name in urban warfare manuals for decades, the grenade embrace. His men literally clung to German soldiers to neutralize the Luftwaffe's advantage, since it could not bomb positions where friend and foe were completely intermingled. Soviet assault groups operated in cells of 3 to 5 men, armed with PPS H-41 submachine guns and hand grenades, fighting room by room, landing by landing, basement by basement. The noise was physical, almost tangible. Metal striking concrete, explosions in confined spaces bursting eardrums, the smell of gunpowder mingling with the stench of bodies that had lain for days without anyone being able to recover them. But the tactic had a mathematical limit. Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army still fielded more than 300,000 men and was supported by General Wolfram von Richthofen's Fourth Air Fleet, which had between 500 and 600 operational aircraft by mid-September. Every week, the 62nd Army received reinforcements crossing the Volga in barges under the constant fire of artillery and Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Every week, those reinforcements melted into the crucible, as Chuikov himself later described in his memoirs. 9 rifle divisions and 5 independent brigades crossed the Volga between September 14th and October 26th. By November 1st, Chuikov had approximately the same number of combat-effective troops as he had 2 months earlier, around 50,000. Everything he had received had evaporated in the fighting. Here lies the first crack in history. Paulus took 3 months to capture 90% of the city, but the remaining 10%, a strip of land roughly 1,000 meters wide and 3 kilometers long in the northern factory district, remained in Soviet hands. It was precisely that resistance that gave Zhukov and Vasilevsky the time they needed to plan Operation Uranus. The question is, what would have happened if Paulus had captured that remaining 10% before November 19, 1942? The conditions for a German victory, what would have had to happen? For Germany to win the Battle of Stalingrad, it would have had to fulfill at least one of 3 possible conditions. It could have captured the entire city before the Stavka launched its counter-offensive. It could have destroyed the Stavka's reserve forces before they were fully concentrated. Or it could have defended the flanks protecting the Sixth Army with sufficient strength to withstand a massive attack. None of these three conditions was met. Yet each of them is plausible if one alters factors that did in fact occur historically. Let us begin with the first condition, the complete capture of the city. Historian David Glantz, in his book Endgame at Stalingrad, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2014, documents with watchmaker-like precision how the Sixth Army came remarkably close to achieving this in October 1942 during the so-called October offensives. Between October 14th and 26th, the German infantry divisions launched the most intense assault of the entire battle, supported by engineer-pioneer units specially trained in urban combat. The 14th Panzer Division, the 94th Infantry Division, and the 305th Infantry Division advanced from the north toward the tractor factory, the Barricadi artillery factory, and the Red October steel works. At that point, Paulus was separated from the west bank of the Volga by barely 400 meters. Drawing on the recently rediscovered Sixth Army war diaries and Soviet archival documents, Glantz calculates that the Soviet 62nd Army's divisions had been reduced to such an extent that some no longer possessed even the combat strength of a single battalion. General Alexander Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Division, which had crossed the Volga under enemy fire on the night of September 14th and temporarily saved the city, had by mid-October fewer than 500 men still capable of firing a weapon. What saved Chuikov in October was not tactical genius, it was time. The Stavka needed 3 more weeks to concentrate the forces for Operation Uranus. And those 3 weeks were precisely what Chuikov purchased through his stubborn resistance. 3 weeks less resistance. That was all that separated Germany from victory at Stalingrad. How might Paulus have saved those 3 weeks? Military historians have identified several concrete possibilities. First, a greater concentration of force in the northern sector of the city rather than dispersing it across the entire urban front. Second, the deployment of additional assault pioneer units, which were in chronic short supply but were available in other sectors of Army Group B. Third, reducing the time lost in disputes between Paulus and his superiors over whether to continue the advance or consolidate positions, disagreements that cost entire days of operations. General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Chief of the General Staff on September 24, 1942, advanced precisely this argument in October. The Sixth Army was not receiving the supplies it required. On average, only half of the necessary daily supply trains arrived. By November, the horses pulling the artillery of the infantry divisions were so malnourished that many did not survive the journey to winter recovery stations. The soldiers were living on reduced rations and had no adequate reserves of winter clothing. Had those crucial 3 weeks been shortened, had Germany captured Stalingrad by November 1, 1942, Operation Uranus could not have been launched as planned. The success of the Soviet counteroffensive depended in part on the Sixth Army remaining bogged down inside the city, immobilized, with its flanks guarded by Romanian, Italian and Hungarian Allied forces, the very weak point that Zhukov and Vasilevsky intended to exploit. A captured city would have changed the entire strategic equation. The plan that had to work before the genesis of Operation Uranus. On September 12, 1942, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and General Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky met with Stalin in the Kremlin. They had studied the maps for weeks. The solution they proposed was not a frontal counterattack, it was something different. A double envelopment operation that would cut the supply lines of the German Sixth Army by exploiting the weakness of its flanks. Here, there is a historical discrepancy worth noting. Zhukov claimed in his memoirs, published in 1969, that he was the one who proposed the central idea of Operation Uranus on September 12th. General Andrei Eremenko, commander of the Stalingrad front, stated in his own memoirs, published in 1961, that he was the one who first sent the Stavka, on October 6th and 9th, the proposal for a broad encirclement. Glantz, examining Stalin's personal appointment diary, demonstrated that Zhukov had no recorded meeting with the dictator between August 31st and September 26th, making Zhukov's chronology unlikely. The key meetings took place between September 27th and 29th. The detail matters because it reveals something fundamental. Operation Uranus was not a brilliant plan that emerged from a moment of genius in the Kremlin. It was the result of weeks of debate, of the failures of the attacks based on the old solution, the shallow encirclements that the Red Army had repeatedly attempted since July, and of Eremenko's stubborn proposal to seek a different solution. A solution that would cut off the Germans not 10 kilometers from Stalingrad, but 80 or even 150 kilometers away, striking the flanks held by the Romanians and Italians. The Romanian army on the Don was the key. The Romanian Third Army, deployed on the northern flank of the Sixth Army from the town of Kletskaya to Serafimovic, covered more than 300 kilometers with divisions that lacked modern anti-tank weapons, adequate air support, and mobile reserves. A Romanian division had only a single battery of obsolete 37mm anti-tank guns in the very sector where the Red Army planned to send hundreds of T-34 tanks. On October 22, 1942, the Stavka ordered the creation of the new Southwestern Front under the command of 40-year-old Colonel General Nikolai Fyodorovich Vatutin, with General Prokofy Romanenko's 5th Tank Army as the main spearhead. By November 1st, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers, distributed among Vatutin's Southwestern Front, Rokossovsky's Don Front, and Eremenko's Stalingrad Front, had been concentrated around the outer perimeter of the battle, waiting for the signal to attack. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 in the morning, under a freezing fog that prevented the Luftwaffe from taking flight, more than 3,500 Soviet guns and howitzers opened fire simultaneously on the Romanian positions north of the Stalingrad pocket. The artillery preparation lasted 80 minutes. It was the greatest sound that Europe had heard since the First World War. 72 hours later, on November 23rd, Soviet tanks met at Sovetski, 70 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was surrounded, but this happened because Stalingrad had not yet fallen. Now let us imagine that it had. A different November, the city taken. If the German Sixth Army had captured Stalingrad in its entirety by November 1st, 1942, the Stavka would have faced a radically different situation. The city itself would no longer have served as the anchor of the Soviet defense. Without Chuikov's 62nd Army occupying the urban core and absorbing the bulk of Paulus's forces, the Sixth Army would have had greater freedom of movement to reorganize and, possibly, to reinforce its flanks. However, this would not have happened automatically. Historians point out that the capture of a city reduced to ruins would not have immediately translated into the availability of forces capable of defending the outer perimeter. Here lies the central paradox of this alternate history. The German Sixth Army would have been exhausted even if it had won. Glantz's statistics are brutal. By mid-November 1942, the 16 divisions of the Sixth Army had an accumulated shortage of 107,982 men, with an average of 6,748 per division. The 24th Panzer Division, which had spearheaded the advance towards Stalingrad, began the battle with 11,000 men. Between June 28th and October 31st, it suffered 5,870 casualties among dead, severely wounded and missing. Its 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments, its motorcycle battalion, and its combat engineer battalion together numbered, in October, only 41 officers and 960 soldiers. A panzer division reduced to 1,000 combat troops. Even if Stalingrad had fallen on November 1st, the Sixth Army would have needed weeks to regroup, redistribute its units, replenish ammunition and fuel supplies, and, theoretically, strengthen its flanks. By November 19th, the date of the Soviet attack, only 3 weeks would have passed since the hypothetical fall of the city. The Stavka, with its plan already underway and more than 1 million men concentrated, would not have waited those 3 weeks. Operation Uranus would have taken place regardless. The question is whether it would have achieved the same result. The essential difference would have been the German position on the flanks. With the Sixth Army partially reorganized and the city already taken, Paulus would have had the option, perhaps even the tactical obligation, to pull his perimeter back to the west, shortening the front line and allowing the Romanian Third Army to cover less ground. But this depended on two variables that historically never materialized: that Hitler would give the order to retreat and that supplies would arrive in time to sustain a movement of that nature. In real history, Hitler never gave that order. He did not give it when it was still possible, and he did not give it when it had already become necessary. Hitler and the logic of defeat. Friedrich Paulus was a brilliant man trapped by his own loyalty. He had devoted his life to the German General Staff, had risen through his own merits to the rank of General der Panzertruppe, and had been chosen by Hitler to command the Sixth Army in January 1942 precisely because he was a trusted officer and a meticulous planner. But at Stalingrad, those very virtues became his downfall. The relationship between Paulus and Hitler in the autumn of 1942 illustrates one of the most revealing failures of German command during the war. Paulus was fully aware of the vulnerability of his flanks. On more than one occasion, he conveyed to his superiors his concerns about the situation of the Romanian and Italian units that covered the 600-kilometer front to the north and south of his army. Colonel General Maximilian von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, Paulus's immediate superior, shared these concerns and repeatedly raised them with Hitler. Zeitzler himself, the new chief of the General Staff, held a private meeting with Hitler in mid-October, in which he presented what he considered to be the two most critical points regarding the situation on the Eastern Front. The second was this: the most dangerous sector was the long northern flank of the Sixth Army, defended by the weakest and least reliable troops available: Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. Hitler listened. Then he dismissed the general politely and assured him that he was being far too pessimistic. On November 7, 1942, Hitler traveled to Munich to deliver his annual speech commemorating the 1923 beer hall putsch. Before his party comrades, he publicly proclaimed that the Sixth Army had already taken Stalingrad. It was a false statement, delivered before tens of thousands of people, which his subordinates dutifully repeated as if it had somehow revitalized the exhausted troops at the front. Hitler remained in Germany until November 23rd. While Soviet tanks were closing the encirclement around 250,000 German soldiers, the Führer was at Berchtesgaden. But what if Stalingrad had fallen completely before the Munich speech? Would that have changed Hitler's behavior? The answer that emerges from historical study is unsettling, probably not to a sufficient degree. Hitler held an unwavering belief that whatever had been conquered had to be maintained. The same logic that led him to insist that the Sixth Army must not retreat a single meter at Stalingrad would have operated in a Stalingrad that had been conquered. The prize had to be preserved, and preserving it would have required defending the existing perimeter, not shortening it. Several German documents from October 1942, cited by Glantz from the Sixth Army's war diaries, reveal that Hitler ordered on September 13th the preparation of limited advances to secure the flanks once Stalingrad had fallen, particularly towards Astrakhan in the Volga Delta. This meant that in the hypothetical scenario of a German victory in the city, the next order would have been to advance even further east, towards the Caspian Sea, rather than consolidate and reinforce the existing positions. That expansionist logic would have stretched even further a supply line that was already, by November 1942, almost impossible to sustain. The problem of the flanks, the structural trap of Army Group B. Even assuming that Germany had captured Stalingrad, the fundamental threat posed by Operation Uranus would have remained structural, not circumstantial. The problem was not that the Romanians were poor soldiers, it was that they were deployed along an excessively long front with insufficient weaponry to withstand a modern armoured attack. The Romanian Third Army was responsible for defending more than 300 kilometres of the Don River's banks with divisions that, according to the order of battle data documented by Glantz, in most cases had only a single anti-tank battery of 4 37mm guns per regiment. The Soviet T-34 tank could withstand without difficulty the impact of those shells against its frontal armour. The Romanian Fourth Army, south of the pocket, was in a similar situation. Between the two, covering the northwestern flank, was the Italian Eighth Army, which was likewise lacking effective anti-tank weapons and motorized troops capable of creating rapidly deployable reaction reserves. Hitler was aware of this. From September onward, he repeatedly ordered the Luftwaffe to intensify interdiction attacks against the bridges over the Don and the suspected concentration areas on the northern bank. He issued Operational Order No. 1 on October 14th and a supplement on October 23rd ordering the construction of fallback positions south of the Don. However, these defensive measures never materialized adequately, partly because of lack of time, partly because of a shortage of resources, and partly because Hitler himself was uncomfortable with any measure that suggested retreat or weakness. Field Marshal Fritz Erich von Manstein, who would assume command of the newly formed Army Group Don on November 20, 1942, described the problem with his characteristic brutal clarity. He was being asked to make bricks without straw. With only a handful of exhausted and poorly equipped divisions, he was expected to contain the largest Soviet counteroffensive of the entire war up to that point. In a scenario where Stalingrad had already been conquered, Manstein's situation would have changed in one respect. There would no longer have been a Sixth Army trapped inside the city that needed to be rescued, but the flank would have remained vulnerable. The Romanian Third Army would still have had the same 37mm guns. Vatutin's 5th Tank Army would still have had its hundreds of T-34s, and the Stavka would still have had the same objective, to encircle the German forces, cut their supply lines, and systematically destroy them. The difference would have been in the size and shape of the encirclement. If there had been no immobile Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the Soviets would not have had the same fixed target. But they also would not have needed to advance as far. Their objective would have been more limited, to isolate and destroy the forces that had captured the city, push the German lines back toward the Donets River, and regain the strategic initiative. And that, given the superiority of forces the Soviets possessed in November 1942, they probably would have achieved anyway. The Red Army in November 1942, a transformed force. To understand why a German victory at Stalingrad would not necessarily have saved Germany from its later defeat, it is necessary to understand the condition of the Red Army in the autumn of 1942. Because it was no longer the same army as in 1941. The destruction between June and August 1941 had been overwhelming. During the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army suffered more than 4.5 million casualties among killed, wounded, and prisoners of war. The pre-war armoured formations, the so-called gigantic mechanized corps, were annihilated within weeks. The level of command at army and front level was primitive, with political commissars able to countermand tactical orders and with officers who had survived Stalin's purges of 1937 to 1938, precisely because they had remained silent, which was hardly a selection process favouring the most daring commanders. But the Soviet rearmament and reorganization machine was something unprecedented in military history. The figures are concrete. In the second half of 1942, Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals in the autumn of 1941, sometimes dismantled and reassembled within a matter of weeks, produced 13,436 combat aircraft, 13,268 tanks, and 30,882 artillery pieces. Germany, during the same period, produced 15,109 aircraft, 4,759 tanks, and 7,975 artillery pieces. In the tank category, the ratio was almost 3-to-1 in favor of the Soviets. It was not only production, it was also doctrine. On October 16, 1942, the Stavka issued Order No. 325 concerning the employment of large armored formations. Signed by Stalin, but drafted by his armored warfare experts, the order explicitly prohibited dispersing tank corps into small infantry support units, the practice that had destroyed so much Soviet armored potential in 1942, and ordered their concentration as independent formations for mobile warfare. Tank corps were only to engage German armored forces when they possessed a clear numerical superiority. And on October 9, 1942, Order No. 307 of the People's Commissariat of Defense restored unity of command within the Red Army. Political commissars were reduced to secondary functions. Professional commanders regained full control over their units. It was a sign that Stalin, after 18 months of war, was beginning to trust his generals. That trust was not indiscriminate, it was selective. The generals who had demonstrated ability under adverse circumstances, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, Yeremenko, Chuikov, rose in rank and accumulated greater responsibilities. Those who did not were removed from command positions. Rokossovsky is the most revealing case. He had been arrested in 1937, tortured during the Great Purge, and released in 1940 with several teeth pulled out by NKVD interrogators. In the summer of 1942, he commanded the Don Front. In November, he would orchestrate the secondary phase of Operation Uranus with such precision that he became the leading Soviet expert in offensive operations for the remainder of the war. But there was something deeper than generals and tanks. There was a structural problem that the Red Army had been solving since 1941 with a speed of learning that its enemies had never anticipated. Lieutenant General Yakov Nikolaevich Fedorenko, head of the Red Army's main directorate of armored and motorized forces, had built no fewer than 28 new tank corps during 1942. These were not the same mechanized corps of the pre-war period, with their deficiencies in radio communications, maintenance, and combined arms coordination. They were formations rebuilt from experience, with a standard organization of 7,200 to 7,600 men, and between 146 and 180 tanks per corps, equipped with motorized infantry battalions and organic artillery to support exploitation without relying on slow formations that could not keep pace with armored advances. When the first of these corps demonstrated that they could not sustain prolonged operations without sufficient infantry support, Fedorenko did not wait for the problem to repeat itself. He designed a heavier variant, the mechanized corps, with 1 or 2 tank brigades and 3 mechanized brigades, each of which included 39 medium tanks and motorized infantry battalions. Depending on the specific organizational structure, a mechanized corps fielded between 175 and 204 tanks. It was a force capable of exploiting a breakthrough, maintaining the advance, and protecting its own flanks. The 4th Mechanized Corps of General Vasily Timofeyevich Volsky, assigned to the Stalingrad front for Operation Uranus, was one of those formations. It had 204 tanks on its roster. It was the unit that advanced from the south after the Soviet breakthrough of November 20th covered more than 80 kilometers in 2 days and linked up with the forces of the southwestern front at Sovetski on November 23rd. 45 kilometers per day. Over frozen terrain, in temperatures between 15 and 25 degrees below zero, with supply lines that stretched longer with every hour of advance. Volsky, before the offensive began, had sent a message to Stalin expressing his doubts about whether the tanks at his disposal were sufficient to accomplish the mission. Stalin personally called him and asked whether he had faith in his men. Volsky said yes. Then he attacked, and he reached Sovetski on schedule. But it was not only tactical speed that had changed, it was the ability to coordinate weapons. On October 31st, 1942, the People's Commissariat of Defense reorganized dozens of independent artillery regiments into 18 new artillery divisions, each with 3 howitzer regiments, 3 gun regiments, and 2 or 3 anti-tank regiments, for a total of between 144 and 168 gun tubes per division. For the first time in the history of the Red Army, a front commander could assemble within 24 hours a mass of firepower consisting of thousands of guns against a specific sector of the front without depending on units from different corps receiving and carrying out artillery coordination orders that often arrived late and sometimes never arrived at all. The artillery preparation that opened Operation Uranus on November 19th lasted 80 minutes. During that time, more than 3,500 guns and howitzers fired against the positions of the Romanian Third Army across a 22-kilometre-wide sector. The average density was more than 70 guns per kilometre of front. In the sectors where the main attack was concentrated, it reached 100. The Romanian divisions, which in their best sectors had 4 37mm anti-tank guns per regiment, did not survive that weight of fire. Those that were not destroyed in the first minutes of the artillery preparation were left disorganized, without communications, and without commanders capable of issuing coherent orders. When the T-34 tanks arrived with their 76mm frontal armor, the 37mm guns that were still operational fired and watched as their shells simply bounced off. The Romanian divisions did not retreat because they were cowards. They retreated because the weapon that was supposed to stop the tanks was simply physically incapable of doing so. There is another factor that is generally underestimated in analyses of Operation Uranus: the role of infantry during the breakthrough phase. The popular idea is that the Soviet counteroffensive was a victory of armored forces, and it was during the exploitation phase. But the gap that allowed the tanks to enter was opened by Soviet rifle infantry, which advanced under the protection of the artillery preparation and captured the Romanian defensive positions in close combat during the first hours of November 19th. The 5th Romanian Cavalry Division, which defended one of the sectors of the main attack by the southwestern front, absorbed the impact of 4 Soviet rifle divisions, supported by direct-fire artillery and multiple BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers. In less than 4 hours, the division had ceased to exist as a coherent combat unit. Its remnants scattered across the steppe. The gap it left behind was 12 kilometers wide. Through it, the tank corps entered, and once the tank corps had broken through, the German problem was no longer tactical. It became operational. The reserves that could have sealed those gaps took hours to move, because the roads were frozen, because German trucks lacked chains, because fuel gelled at those temperatures. By the time the German reserve divisions reached the point where they were needed, Soviet tanks were already 30 kilometers farther south. All of this would have happened with or without the Stalingrad encirclement. The tools were ready. The plan had been approved. The trains had delivered ammunition to the forward supply depots. The Red Army of November 1942 was no longer the Army of June 1941. That transformation was real, structural, and irreversible. And any honest assessment of what would have happened if Germany had won the Battle of Stalingrad has to begin with this basic fact. The enemy Germany would have faced in the winter of 1942 to 1943 was already radically different from the one that had invaded in 1941, and in the following months that difference would only have widened. The chain of consequences: what would have changed and what would not. Let us assume, for the purposes of this analysis, the most favorable possible scenario for Germany. Stalingrad falls at the end of October or in the first days of November 1942. Paulus's Sixth Army completes the conquest of the city. Hitler delivers his Munich speech, telling the truth this time. What are the immediate consequences? First consequence: the Red Army launches Operation Uranus anyway on November 19th because the concentration of forces was already underway and was irreversible by that date. The 1,042,000 men of the 3 Soviet fronts, the 1,550 tanks, the 22,000 artillery pieces and the 1,277 operational aircraft do not wait for the enemy to prepare better. Second consequence: the attack takes place against the same vulnerable flanks, against the same Romanian divisions equipped with the same obsolete anti-tank guns. The Romanian Third Army collapses within the same 48 hours with the same devastating losses. The divisions of the 5th Tank Army advance southward at the same speed of 40 to 45 kilometers per day. The forces of Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps advance from the south. But the third consequence changes. There is no immobile 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad to be encircled. Paulus, although exhausted, has freedom of movement. He can order a withdrawal to the west before the encirclement is completed. Would he do it? Would Hitler allow it? Real history gives us the answer. On November 23, 1942, when the encirclement was closing and Paulus still had the possibility of attempting a breakout, he sent Hitler a radio message requesting authorization to withdraw the 6th Army toward the southwest. Hitler's response arrived the same day: hold out in the Stalingrad fortress. Paulus did not possess stehen bleiben, the authority to act without waiting for the Führer's order. He obeyed. In the alternative scenario, with Stalingrad already captured but under the threat of encirclement, the withdrawal would have required the same permission from Hitler. And Hitler, with his well-documented obsession with holding captured ground, would have had exactly the same instinct to forbid it. The difference is that in this case there would have been no logistical argument for remaining. There was no city to defend, only a position on the Don steppes. Perhaps this time he would have given the order to retreat. Perhaps. If Paulus had managed to withdraw the forces of the 6th Army toward the western Donets before November 25th, he would have saved an army. An exhausted army without fuel reserves, with most of its draft horses dead from starvation, with a deficit of 100,000 men, but still an army. And that army would have provided the reserve that Manstein desperately needed to contain the successive Soviet counteroffensives of the winter. The winter of 1942 to 1943 in a world without Kessel. There is a dimension of the Battle of Stalingrad that most popular accounts ignore because it is less dramatic than the fighting in the basements of the tractor factory. But it is perhaps the most important of all. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 because it needed oil. Not as a secondary objective, as a fundamental strategic imperative. Hitler explained this with brutal clarity on repeated occasions. In Führer Directive No. 41, issued on April 4, 1942, which established the objectives of Operation Blue, the original name of the 1942 summer campaign before Stalingrad overshadowed everything else. The primary objective was not the city on the Volga. It was the Caucasus, specifically the oil fields of Baku in present-day Azerbaijan, which in 1942 produced more than 70% of Soviet oil. Stalingrad was a secondary objective in that directive, an industrial city and communications hub whose name certainly had propaganda value, but whose capture did not solve Germany's fundamental problem. The Wehrmacht consumed more fuel than the Third Reich could produce. The figures are revealing. In 1941, Germany produced approximately 5.7 million tons of oil by combining its synthetic production, the hydrogenation process of coal that IG Farben technicians had developed in the 1930s, with imports from Romania, which supplied around 5 million tons annually from the Ploiești oil fields. That total was insufficient to simultaneously sustain a war in the east, operations in North Africa, and the supply of the submarine fleet in the Atlantic. In 1942, the situation worsened because Allied bombing raids against Romanian facilities began reducing Ploiești production, while German reserves accumulated before the summer campaign had been consumed. General Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's Office for War Economy, OKW, had warned in several memoranda throughout 1941 that the German war economy was structurally unbalanced. Armaments production was increasing, but there was a critical dependence on external energy sources. Without Soviet oil, the German General Staff calculated that the Third Reich had strategic reserves sufficient for between 18 and 24 months of intensive warfare. After that period, Large-scale armoured operations would become impossible to sustain. It was, literally, a clock. That clock had been running since June 1941. And Operation Blue in 1942 was the attempt to stop it before it reached zero. In August 1942, Army Group A captured the small Maikop oil field in the northern Caucasus, which had produced approximately 400,000 tons annually before the war, a fraction of total Soviet output, but a valuable symbol. The retreating Soviets destroyed every installation. German engineers from the Deutsche Erdöl AG company, deployed behind the advancing forces, discovered that restoring production would require not weeks but months, as well as technical equipment that could not be delivered by road under the existing logistical conditions. By November 1942, Maikop was producing 0 tons of oil for Germany. The larger fields remained beyond reach. Grozny in Chechnya had produced around 2 million tons annually before the war and was still more than 200 kilometers from the most advanced German positions in the autumn of 1942. Baku, on the Caspian Sea, with its capacity of 23 million tons annually, was more than 600 kilometers away. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, commander of Army Group A, found himself stalled hundreds of kilometers from his objective with a supply line that passed through the bottleneck of Rostov and then stretched across unpaved roads. The entire logistics of the advance toward the Caucasus had to pass through a single city, Rostov-on-Don, and from Rostov southward, mountainous terrain and primitive roads forced supplies to be transferred from trains to trucks or horse-drawn carts. This limited the flow to a fraction of what was required. In November, the 13th Panzer Division, which had advanced more than 2,000 kilometers from its starting point 16 months earlier, was surrounded on the outskirts of Ordzhonikidze by Soviet forces of the Northern Group of the Transcaucasian Front under General Ivan Ivanovich Maslenikov. When the 1st Panzer Army finally managed to withdraw the division from that trap, the captured or destroyed equipment left behind included 40 tanks, 7 armoured personnel carriers, 70 artillery pieces, and more than 2,350 vehicles. The 3rd Panzer Corps, which also included the 23rd Panzer Division and other units, lost around 5,000 killed and wounded in those battles. This happened at the same time that Paulus was attempting to seize the last few meters of Stalingrad, 2 arms of the same effort, both reaching the limit of their capabilities at the same moment. Even if Stalingrad had fallen on November 1st, 1942, the Caucasus would still have remained Soviet. And without Caucasian oil, the problem accelerating the German defeat would have remained exactly the same. The panzer divisions would have run out of fuel. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, like an engine that is dying. But the energy equation had another dimension that battlefield-centered analyses often overlook: German synthetic oil. From the mid-1930s onward, the Nazi regime had invested massively in the coal hydrogenation process, which made it possible to convert coal, of which Germany possessed abundant reserves in the Ruhr and Silesia, into aviation fuel, gasoline for armoured vehicles, and motor oils. In 1943, hydrogenation plants would produce approximately 5.7 million tons of synthetic fuel, the equivalent of the entire output of Ploiești. But that production required enormous quantities of coal, electricity, and steel, resources that directly competed with the production of armoured vehicles, shells, and aircraft. And there was another critical vulnerability. Hydrogenation plants were perfect targets for Allied strategic aviation. They were enormous, fixed installations, with complex equipment that took months to repair. When Allied bombers began systematically attacking them in 1944, German synthetic fuel production collapsed within a matter of weeks. In the summer of 1944, some German panzer groups reported that their tanks could not move because of a lack of fuel, not because they had been destroyed in combat. That would have happened regardless in a world where Germany had won at Stalingrad. The location of the hydrogenation plants would not have changed with victory or defeat on the Volga. Germany's dependence on foreign oil would not have been solved by Stalingrad either. Romania, the main external source, produced around 5 million tons in 1942, but that production declined every year as the most profitable oil fields became depleted. Hungary contributed only minimal quantities. Austria had small oil fields in the Vienna region. None of this was sufficient to sustain a multi-front war against three of the world's greatest industrial powers. The historian Richard Overy, in his analysis of the Third Reich's war economy, points out that Germany entered the Second World War with strategic oil reserves sufficient for 6 months of intensive operations. It replenished them by looting French reserves in 1940 and absorbing Romanian production. But by 1942, those reserves had not been rebuilt. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad received approximately half of the daily supply trains it required. The horses of infantry artillery were so malnourished that many died during transfers. Logistics, not tactics, was the clock running against Germany. And there is one final piece of this energy puzzle that makes the alternative history even darker for the Germans: the coal of the Donets. The Donets Basin in eastern Ukraine was the largest coal reserve in the Soviet Union. It produced more than 85 million tons annually before the war. When the Germans occupied it in 1941 and 1942, they found that the mines had been systematically destroyed or flooded by the retreating Soviets. The restoration of production progressed slowly, with forced labor and shortages of technical equipment. By the summer of 1942, production in the Donets Basin under German occupation was only 4 million tons, less than 5% of its previous capacity. That coal was necessary not only as an energy source but also as a raw material for the synthetic hydrogenation process. Without sufficient coal, without Caucasian oil, without access to the reserves of the Caspian region, the German war economy continued operating on a razor's edge. A victory at Stalingrad would not have moved that razor's edge. It would have left it exactly where it was. The only possible difference would have been political morale, the perception of strength that might have complicated the decision of the Western Allies to continue the war. But even that would have been temporary. Economic reality would inevitably have prevailed in the end. The problem that is never mentioned: oil and the economic logic of war. There is a dimension of the Battle of Stalingrad that most popular accounts ignore because it is less dramatic than the fighting in the basements of the tractor factory. But it is, perhaps, the most important of all. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 because it needed oil, not as a secondary objective, as a fundamental strategic imperative. Hitler explained this with brutal clarity on numerous occasions. In Führer Directive No. 41, issued on April 4, 1942, which established the objectives of Operation Blue, the original name of the 1942 summer campaign before Stalingrad overshadowed everything else. The primary objective was not the city on the Volga. It was the Caucasus, specifically the oil fields of Baku in present-day Azerbaijan, which in 1942 produced more than 70% of Soviet oil output. Stalingrad was a secondary objective in that directive, an industrial city and a communications hub whose name had undeniable propaganda value, but whose capture did not solve Germany's fundamental problem. The Wehrmacht consumed more fuel than the Third Reich could produce. In August 1942, Army Group A captured the small oil field of Maikop in the northern Caucasus. The retreating Soviets destroyed all the facilities. German engineers discovered that it would take months to restore production. Meanwhile, the larger oil fields, Grozny in Chechnya and Baku on the Caspian Sea, remained out of reach. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, commander of Army Group A, found himself paralyzed hundreds of kilometers from his objective, with a supply line that passed through the bottleneck of Rostov and then stretched across unpaved roads. In November, the 13th Panzer Division, which had advanced more than 2,000 kilometers from its starting point 16 months earlier, was surrounded on the outskirts of Ordzhonikidze by Soviet forces from General Ivan Maslenikov's northern group, it left behind most of its equipment when it managed to break through. Even if Stalingrad had fallen, the Caucasus would have remained Soviet. And without Caucasian oil, the problem that accelerated Germany's defeat would have remained exactly the same. The panzer divisions would have run out of fuel. The aircraft would have been without kerosene. The ships without engine oil. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, like an engine dying from a lack of lubrication. The map in December 1943 where the war would have gone. If we accept that, even with a German victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army would still have launched its counter-offensive and would have regained ground during the winter of 1942 to 1943, the next question is more difficult. Would it have changed the course of the war in the long term? To answer this, we must examine the global context of November 1942. On November 8th of that year, in the middle of the Battle of Stalingrad, Anglo-American forces landed in North Africa in Operation Torch. By May 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps and its Italian allies had surrendered in Tunisia, 275,000 prisoners. In July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. That same month, Operation Citadel, the last major German panzer offensive on the Eastern Front in the Kursk salient, ended in failure. The war in the West was moving forward independently of what happened at Stalingrad. The most optimistic scenario for Germany in a world without the Stalingrad encirclement would have involved a withdrawn and partially rebuilt Sixth Army, a stronger defensive line on the Donets for the winter of 1942 to 1943, perhaps the preservation of Army Group A's positions in the northern Caucasus for a few more months. But by the summer of 1943, Soviet production of tanks and aircraft would have continued to exceed German production at a ratio of 3-to-1. The Western Allies would have continued landing in the Mediterranean. Strategic bombing against German industrial cities would have continued to intensify. Pressure from the east, west, and south was simultaneous and coordinated. Manstein, who was probably the sharpest German strategic thinker of that period of the war, expressed this clearly in his memoirs, Verloren Siege, Lost Victories, published in 1955. Even after the defensive tactical successes of the spring of 1943, in which he managed to temporarily retake Kharkov through a brilliant counterattack, he acknowledged that Germany needed a political solution, not a military one, to win the war. The disparity in resources was simply too great. A German Stalingrad would have bought time, perhaps a year, perhaps two, but it would not have reversed the logic of the numbers. The global angle, the United States and the Lend-Lease equation. There is one factor that analyses focused exclusively on the Eastern Front tend to underestimate: the role of the United States. From October 1941 onward, the American Lend-Lease program sent material to the Soviet Union through three routes: the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the so-called Persian Corridor, and an air route from Alaska to Siberia. The first Lend-Lease protocol, signed in October 1941, included the shipment of 267 bombers, 278 fighters, 363 medium tanks, and 420 light tanks, as well as 16,502 cargo trucks before June 1942. The second protocol, covering approximately June 1942 to June 1943, added another 3,816 aircraft, 1,206 tanks, and 62,292 automatic weapons. But the most important figure in that second protocol was the number of trucks: 93,713 vehicles. The Studebaker US-6 trucks that arrived from the United States became the backbone of Soviet logistics during the second half of the war. The Stalingrad front used 27,000 motor vehicles to sustain Zhuikov's 62nd Army while preparing Operation Uranus. A significant portion of those vehicles came through Lend-Lease. Without Lend-Lease, Operation Uranus would have been slower and perhaps less effective. With Lend-Lease, Operation Uranus was militarily feasible even if Stalingrad had fallen earlier. But there was an even deeper geopolitical implication. The mood among Western leaders in the autumn of 1942 was fragile. Churchill had been under pressure from British public opinion for months, which demanded the opening of a second front to relieve pressure on the Soviets. Roosevelt faced his own domestic pressures. A Soviet defeat at Stalingrad, if it had occurred, would have sent a devastating signal to the Western world that the Red Army was incapable of containing the Wehrmacht, that the Soviet Union might be on the verge of collapse. In that atmosphere, pressure to reach a negotiated agreement with Germany, something that some British conservative circles had considered since 1940, would have resurfaced strongly. This does not mean that Churchill would have given in, but it does mean that the pressure on the Allied coalition would have been enormous. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not merely a military victory. It was a political signal to the world. It demonstrated that Germany could be defeated. Without that signal, maintaining the cohesion of the Allied coalition would have been far more difficult. Turkey, Japan, and the third parties on the sidelines. A German victory at Stalingrad would have activated, with almost mathematical certainty, two actors who in real history remained neutral or outside the Eastern Front: Turkey and Japan. Turkey had maintained a policy of cautious neutrality since 1940. The Ankara government had a friendship treaty with Germany signed in June 1941, only days before the invasion of the USSR. The implicit condition was that Turkey would join the Axis powers if Germany demonstrated that it could win the war. Throughout 1941 and 1942, the Turkish army remained mobilized and was equipped largely with German material. A fall of Stalingrad, which would have opened the route toward Baku and the Caspian Sea, would have placed Turkey before a concrete decision: either enter the war alongside Germany in order to participate in the division of the spoils, or watch German and Soviet forces fight at its doorstep. The government of İsmet İnönü, which was fully aware that Turkey did not possess the armed forces required for a war between great powers, would probably have resisted the pressure. But German access to the Caucasus and the Caspian region would have made a reassessment of Turkish neutrality inevitable. Japan is a more complex matter. In 1942, Japan was already fighting in the Pacific against the United States as well as in China. However, it maintained a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941, which both sides respected meticulously. The Soviets were therefore able to transfer dozens of divisions from Siberia to the Western Front during 1941 and 1942. Divisions that were decisive in the defense of Moscow and in Operation Uranus. If Stalingrad had fallen, Japan's temptation to attack the Soviet Union from the east would have increased enormously. It is not certain that the Japanese command would have made such a decision. The Imperial Army had its own priorities in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But the political pressure would have been real, and if Japan had opened a front in Siberia, the Soviet Union would have been forced to divide its forces between two simultaneous theaters of operations. That truly could have changed the course of the war. The Soviet interior, what a defeat would have meant for Stalin. In the Soviet Union of 1942, the war was a total event that permeated everything: food supplies, labor, education, and information. Civilians who were not at the front worked in armaments factories 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Cities evacuated east of the Urals received factories dismantled and transported by train, which were sometimes assembled on frozen ground, without walls or roofs, with workers operating in sub-zero temperatures. The internal cohesion of this effort rested on a terrifying balance. Stalin had killed or sent millions of people to the Gulag before the war. In 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured by the Germans, partly because some preferred surrender to continuing to fight for the regime. NK-5D blocking divisions, stationed behind infantry lines with orders to shoot those who retreated without authorization, were a daily reality. A defeat at Stalingrad would have pushed these tensions to their absolute limit. The non-Russian peoples of the Soviet interior, Kazakhs, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, Don Cossacks, who already in 1942 displayed in some areas attitudes of collaboration with the Germans, would have had stronger reasons to desert or resist the Soviet regime. The collaborationist movement led by General Andrei Vlasov, who founded the Russian Liberation Army with German support, might have gained greater legitimacy. But Stalin also possessed resources that an alternative history cannot ignore. His repression apparatus was more efficient than that of Nazi Germany in maintaining internal unity under pressure. Furthermore, the Germans, through their occupation policies in Soviet territories, massacres, forced labor, and systematic starvation, had destroyed their own ability to exploit internal Soviet discontent. The populations that initially welcomed German troops as liberators in Ukraine and the Baltic states quickly discovered that the Nazis had not come to liberate anyone. A defeat at Stalingrad would have shaken the system, but it probably would not have brought it down. The history of the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945 is the history of a state that survived losses that would have destroyed any other political system known up to that point. Manstein and the miracle that cannot be repeated. In the alternative scenario, Fritz Erich von Manstein is the central figure in the German response to the Soviet counteroffensive of the winter of 1942 to 1943. Manstein had received the Field Marshal's baton in July 1942 after the conquest of Sevastopol. He was, by the acclaim of friends and enemies alike, the most skilled strategic operational commander produced by the German military leadership. His ability to maneuver with inferior forces, to create reserves out of nothing, and to employ them at the exact right moment, made him the obvious choice to contain the Soviet disaster. In actual history, he received command of Army Group Don on November 20, 1942, precisely when the encirclement of Stalingrad was closing. With a handful of exhausted divisions and General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army as his main instrument, he attempted Operation Winter Storm, a relief attack from Kotelnikovo northward toward the Stalingrad pocket. He came within less than 50 kilometers of the perimeter before being stopped by Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Corps. When that attempt failed, Manstein carried out something equally brilliant. An orderly withdrawal that preserved Army Group A from the trap in the Caucasus, while the Soviets attempted to cut off their retreat through Rostov, and in February to March 1943, after the Soviets had overextended their lines while pursuing what they believed was a defeated army, Manstein launched a devastating counterattack, recaptured Kharkov, and stabilized the front. That counterattack was possible because the Soviets committed exactly the mistake Manstein had predicted, advancing too quickly, failing to secure their flanks, and relying on their superiority. In the alternative scenario, without the Stalingrad Kessel, Manstein would have had more forces available for that counteroffensive maneuver. The 6th Army, or what remained of it, would have formed part of the maneuver force instead of becoming a permanent loss. The spring 1943 counter-offensive could have been deeper, broader, and longer-lasting, but only up to a certain point. Because Operation Citadel in July 1943, the German attempt to eliminate the Kursk salient, failed not because of a lack of tactical ability, but because of a reason that had no possible alternative solution. The Soviets knew the German plans in advance thanks to their intelligence network, and they had built a defensive system more than 300 kilometers deep, with minefields, layered anti-tank positions, and armored reserves positioned for the decisive moment. Even with the 6th Army intact, Kursk would have ended the same way. The mirage of a negotiated peace. Was there a political way out? After Stalingrad, several senior German commanders, Zeitzler, Legation Secretary of State Peter Kleist, and some diplomats from the Auswärtiges Amt began secretly exploring the possibility of a negotiated peace with the Soviet Union. The logic was simple. If an armistice could be reached in the East before the superiority of the Western Allies became overwhelming, Germany would at least have the possibility of surviving as a state. But these attempts encountered two insurmountable obstacles. The first was Hitler. A negotiated peace with the Soviet Union would have meant giving up the conquered territories, recognizing the pre-war borders, perhaps even more. Hitler was psychologically incapable of considering such a possibility. In his worldview, the Soviet Union was the primary racial and ideological enemy, and the war in the East was a war of annihilation, not a classical war of territorial conquest. Peace with Stalin was a contradiction within the very foundations of Nazism. The second obstacle was Stalin. The Soviet dictator knew that time was on his side. Every month that passed, Soviet production superiority over Germany increased. Every month that passed, the second front in the West that he demanded became more imminent. Why make territorial concessions in 1943 when he could recover everything in 1944 or 1945? A German victory at Stalingrad would have changed Stalin's calculations at the margins, but not fundamentally. The Soviet dictator was a cold-blooded negotiator who always sought the position of maximum advantage before opening his mouth. In November 1942, that position was attack, encircle, destroy. In a world where Stalingrad had fallen and Operation Uranus had achieved more limited results, Stalin might have briefly considered the possibility of agreeing to a ceasefire that preserved the Soviet territories east of the Dnieper. But for that to happen, there would have had to be a willing interlocutor in Berlin, and in Berlin that interlocutor did not exist. The final account: why Germany could not win the war even if it had won Stalingrad. There is a phrase that appears with variations in the writings of several German generals who survived the war. We won every battle and lost the war. It is a formulation that contains more truth than its authors intended, and also more self-deception. Germany did not win every battle. It lost Moscow in December 1941. It lost the attempt to cut off British supply routes in the Mediterranean. It lost the Battle of Britain. But there is something true at the core of that phrase. The Wehrmacht was, until 1943, the most effective land force in the world in tactical and operational terms. Its general staff officers were better trained. Its battlefield communications were more efficient. Its doctrine of decentralized command, the Auftragstaktik or mission-type tactics, allowed a speed of decision-making that the centralized Soviet command system could never fully match. But tactical efficiency has a limit when the imbalance of resources is sufficiently large. And that imbalance was already, by the autumn of 1942, structurally impossible for Germany to overcome. The German wartime economy in 1942 produced 4,759 tanks. The Soviet economy produced 24,400, not across 2 or 3 fronts, on the same front. Army Group South had 2 panzer armies with fewer than 1,000 operational tanks in total when Operation Uranus began. The 3 Soviet fronts had 1,550. These figures do not reflect German incompetence. They reflect the consequence of a fundamental strategic decision that Hitler had made from the beginning of the war. Germany would not fully mobilize its economy for total war until it was certain it could win. It was a circular logic that prevented it from building the material foundation required for victory. Soviet factories had been relocated east of the Urals in the autumn of 1941 at a terrible human cost, with workers operating on frozen ground under temperatures of -30 degrees. But they were producing. German factories, until 1943, operated under peacetime conditions, with a standard work week and without the additional second shift that military urgency would have required. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments from February 1942, pointed this out precisely in his memoirs. And he acknowledged that when the total mobilization of the German economy began, it was already too late. Men who would have survived. There is a dimension of any alternative history that geopolitical analyses tend to forget: human beings. If the German Sixth Army had managed to withdraw in November 1942 instead of being trapped, 250,000 men would not have died of hunger, cold and disease in the Kessel or in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. Soldiers who had begun the war as 20-year-old young men in 1939, who had fought through Poland, France, the Balkans and the Eastern Front, would have had a chance to survive. Of the 250,000 men trapped in the Kessel, approximately 91,000 surrendered on February 2, 1943. Of those 91,000, around 5,000 eventually returned to Germany. The rest died in captivity, mostly from disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, whom Hitler promoted one day before his surrender so that he would not give himself up, no German field marshal had ever surrendered before, lived until 1957 in the German Democratic Republic. General of Artillery Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had commanded the 51st Army Corps and who became one of the founders of the National Committee for a Free Germany, the organization of German prisoner officers who collaborated with the Soviets, returned to West Germany in 1955. He had spent 12 years in the camps. If Stalingrad had ended differently, those men would have remained at the front. Some would have died anyway at Kursk during the retreat toward the Dnieper, or in Normandy if the German Fourth Army had managed to be transferred westward. But they would have had a chance that the Kessel denied them. The final balance, the point of no return that was not Stalingrad. After all this analysis, the question must be answered directly. Would the outcome of the Second World War have changed if Germany had won the Battle of Stalingrad? The honest answer is probably not the final outcome, but rather the duration and the cost. The point of no return for Germany was not Stalingrad. It was December 1941. When Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he made the decision that made German victory impossible. At that moment, Germany, with a war economy that was only partially mobilized, with an army exhausted before Moscow, and with a navy incapable of dominating the Atlantic, was simultaneously facing the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the world's first industrial power. No victory at Stalingrad could have reversed that calculation. What Stalingrad did was accelerate the resolution of the conflict. It demonstrated to the world, including the Germans themselves, that blitzkrieg had limits. It destroyed the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, and it consolidated the Allied coalition at a moment when it might have faltered. A German victory would have prolonged the war, perhaps until 1946 or 1947. It would have meant more deaths, more destruction, and more suffering across every continent. The atomic bomb, which the United States was developing at that time through the Manhattan Project, would have arrived regardless. The question would have been who would collapse first. But this is a chain of speculation that has its own limits. What rigorous historical analysis allows us to say with confidence is this: the factors that determined the outcome of the Second World War were, by the autumn of 1942, greater than any single battle. The difference in industrial production, the scale of the Allied coalition, and Germany's inability to secure the resources it needed to sustain the war, all of this was already underway regardless of what happened at Stalingrad. What Stalingrad did change, and why it matters. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 199 days, from the first massive bombardment on August 23, 1942, until the final surrender of Field Marshal Paulus on February 2, 1943. During that period, according to the estimates most widely accepted by historians, between 750,000 and 1.5 million people from all sides died, including Soviet civilians. It was the deadliest battle in human history up to that point, but its importance was not only military, it was political, psychological, and moral. In Berlin, on February 3, 1943, loudspeakers broadcast for the first time during the war the Andante from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the funeral motif that the regime reserved for moments of national catastrophe. 3 days of official mourning. Flags flown at half-mast. Theatres closed. For the first time, the German people heard from their own leaders that the war had been lost somewhere. Not that the war itself had been lost, but that something great had been lost, something that would never be recovered. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, delivered his famous speech on February 18, 1943, at the Berlin Sportpalast, asking whether Germany wanted total war. The crowd roared yes. But that roar now carried the echo of those who already suspected they were on the wrong side of history. In Moscow, the Red Army had demonstrated that it could plan and execute a strategic encirclement operation capable of destroying an entire German field army. That was not what anyone had expected in June 1941. It was something new. In Washington and London, morale soared. The concept of an invincible Germany, which had dominated Western political debate since the fall of France in June 1940, began to collapse. Germany could be defeated. It required only the necessary will, resources, and time. And that, ultimately, is what Stalingrad changed that no alternative German victory could have maintained indefinitely. The perception of what was possible. Perceptions move armies. They move nations. They move history. The Stalingrad Kessel, with its 91,000 starving and frozen prisoners emerging from the ruins on February 2, 1943, was visible to the entire world. The images and accounts reached every continent. And what they said was clear. The Third Reich was not invincible. Its army could be surrounded. Its generals could surrender. A German victory would have hidden that truth for longer, but not indefinitely, because the truth in history, sooner or later, always collects its own debt.